Today we're going to talk about the Justice for Renters Act. That's Prop 33 in the upcoming November election ballot for California. And the ballot seeks to address California's ongoing housing affordability crisis. And it's a bill that is seeking to find a method of controlling the rising cost of housing for those parties who rent units rather than own them. And that makes up roughly 50% of the population in California. So it's a real issue, and we're just going to kind of take a look at it today. So what I thought I'd do is I printed a bunch of articles from a couple of different perspectives here. And so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take a look at what AI will produce, because since we don't seem to ever read original text anymore, I thought I'd take a look at what the AI says about the Justice for Renters Act. It says, in California aims to address housing affordability and tenant protections by implementing several key reforms. The legislation seeks to limit excessive rent increase, enhance eviction protections, and provide more resources for tenants facing hardship. So let's just unpack that just very little bit here. It's limiting excessive rent increases. So again, on the surface of it, that sounds pretty well intended and pretty meaningful. But it is important to put into context what is existing in today's laws here in California. So just a few years ago, the state of California passed AB 1482, and that was a law that prevented excessive rent increases. So previously, if you were not in a rent controlled city or county, then at any given point, a landlord could raise the rent by the amount that they felt that was necessary or that would reach the market rate. Today, a landlord cannot raise the rent more than 5% over the cost of living increase. So in the last several years, the rent increases have ranged from 6 to about 10%. We've had some inflation, so there's been some larger rent increases that are allowed. But the overall long-term effect of this law should be that most tenants can't see more than about a 7% increase per year, which is a lot, arguably. But if a person is not paying near to a market rent, it's a reasonable increase toward, I guess that's the argument there, is that a reasonable increase toward moving toward closer to a market rate. All right, so that's that element there. So looking further into what AI has to say. So it says, from a landlord's perspective, the Justice for Renters Act poses a significant threat, introduces several challenges and adjustments to property management practices. If passed, it would repeal the Costa-Hawkins Rental Act. Well, that's an important piece there. Let's take a look at what that is. So what is Costa-Hawkins? So Costa-Hawkins was a law that was passed in 1995, and it was in response to pressures that were, and actually it was a response to a lawsuit in which at the time there were cities in California that had passed what was vacancy decontrol. So what vacancy decontrol is let's say, and this was something that is, I believe, still in action in New York, where let's say you're paying $1,000 a month and you've got a 3-bedroom house for rented, and you rented it a very, very, very long time ago, and you're subject to rent control, so that rent is not able to go up all that much. Well, let's say you move out. Well, and the market rent for that 3-bedroom house is maybe $3,000 a month. Well, what Costa-Hawkins prevented was cities from forcing that landlord to rent to a new party at that previously below market rent. And that was seen at the time as a meaningful balance between a tenant's rights to have rent-controlled units not go up in rent more than the city wanted them to go up any given year, but allowed the landlord, in the event of a vacancy, to then re-let that unit at the market rate, at the fair market value, okay? So one of the reasons why this is really a key feature of this argument is in cities like New York. And down here in Southern California, there was a time when Santa Monica and West Hollywood also had enacted this vacancy decontrol. One of the problems with this theory that a law can prescribe a landlord to create excessively, and I apologize for using the word excessively, the law can allow a landlord to provide very affordable housing in a very unaffordable marketplace is under the following example. So a landlord, for example, facing a vacancy in his unit where it's $1,000 a month, and his expenses for housing that unit is maybe $300-400 a month. And in order to then re-let that unit, let's say it's vacated, it's going to cost $20,000 or $30,000 or $50,000 to renovate that unit so that it's habitable according to the code as it would be required to do so, because the tenant moves out or whatnot. Well, there's a real disincentive there to actually put that work in to bring that property back into a lettable condition, painting, floors, plumbing issues, whatnot. You certainly don't want a unit that is falling apart going back into the rental market. It not only is it a hassle for the landlord, it's quite detrimental for the tenant to be moving into a space that hasn't been maintained for several years due to a long-term occupancy. So that natural disincentive we have seen in cities where these strong rent control practices are in place. It's just a matter of economic choice. At a certain point, landlords have in fact stopped putting market units back on the market. And then you see laws that are forcing landlords to put them back on the market. And that's, again, my opinion here is maybe overreaching this conversation, but when you have a housing crisis and you are trying to increase the supply of housing, putting in policies that decrease the motivation for landlords to bring housing to market, and let alone maintain it at a reasonable level, the unintended consequence of putting restrictions on landlords can have the unintended consequence of in fact reducing the number of housing stock in a market where we're trying to increase it. So that top-down type of control has a deleterious effect on housing stock in the long term. When you pull the aperture back on a policy like this and you look at how this incentivizes or disincentivizes investors to enter the market and or investors to build more units in a market like this, what we are seeing here in Los Angeles is that policy decisions that have been made in the last few years are really disincentivizing new investors from purchasing investment properties like this. That's having a negative impact on valuation. Again, that's not something that a tenant, again, roughly 50% of the population, is on the front end is terribly concerned about. But on the back end, here's how this plays a role is, look, if housing is not an attractive investment, then you're going to find capital going to other places and developers looking in other directions as to what to build and what to do with their time. I mean, we see this right now in Los Angeles, that new construction starts are in fact on the decline because the economics looking forward are not looking as good as they used to. And part of that has to do with some of the regulatory environment and some of the tenant protections that are preventing the economic requirements necessary to go through all the work to develop those units. Let's take a look at what the perspective from California's Apartment Association. Now, obviously, this is going to be a pro-landlord perspective. Let's see what they have to say here. It says that it talks about Costa-Hawkins here being enacted in 1995, exempting specific properties from rent control, including single-family homes. Again, that's That at the time felt like striking a fair balance. Most folks who owned single-family homes and utilized them as rented properties, those by and large fall into that mom and pop category, or families or persons who buy a home and are successful, refinance, maybe go purchase another home, and instead of selling that first home, they decide to rent it out. Those folks are not professional landlords. It's just something that's an accoutrement to their investment strategy in general. At any rate, the Justice for Renters Act, according here to the CAA, seeks to repeal Costa-Hawkins entirely, allowing for strict rent control on all types of housing, including single-family homes and newer apartments. It would eliminate the ban on vacancy control. Now that's that conversation that we had about what vacancy control is that policy that if a unit becomes vacant, a landlord may raise the rent to what the market will bear, given its condition, location, so on and so forth. Vacancy control would put limits, or allow cities to put limits on what the market rate could be in that unit. That law would significantly impact landlords' ability to adjust rents when a tenant moves out and new renters move in. All right, compounding these concerns is the fact that several cities in California have already put triggers in their local rent control laws that would automatically adopt stricter policies if Costa-Hawkins were repealed. This means the repeal could instantly activate more severe rent control regulations in various jurisdictions. I don't know how to really respond to that particular statement, but it sounds like there are provisions in some local laws that might be triggered. That would be its own scenario. From the California Apartment Associations, it says 5 reasons for you to be worried, and the broadening of rent control includes exempt properties. So this is a big one here. Currently exempt properties such as single-family homes and recent construction could fall under rent control if the act passes. Well, that has 2 major problems. One is that the newly constructed buildings are very expensive to build, and the ability for them to charge a market rate rent is what allows them to be constructed in the first place. And that's what is increasing supply in a state that is supply constrained. So the California Association of Apartment Owners sees that as a major problem. I'm sorry, I misstated that. California Apartment Association. Number 2, increased drive for rent control in more areas. Tenant activists have brought rent control to several California cities in several years. The act's passage would further motivate them to pursue rent control in cities that currently have none. This would lead to new rent control measures in areas previously affected. Okay, that candidly, that sounds a little bit like a scare tactic. I'm not so concerned about that kind of stuff. That's politics. Heightened impact in rent-controlled cities with vacancy control. In cities with existing rent control, the removal of Costa-Hawkins would invite returns of vacancy control. Now that's relatively true. There are some cities, for example, down here in Southern California, anytime this type of conversation happens, cities that have policies that are very, very, tenant-centric, Santa Monica, West Hollywood, they typically are the ones that you see rumblings about vacancy decontrol coming back. Policy shift and market instability. So this is an important one. The act would mark a broader shift toward more stringent housing regulations, bringing uncertainty to the rental housing market and affecting long-term investment decisions. Again, we kind of talked about that in that, when there are laws that are placed that put a burden on the investment community's ability to make long-term decisions to reach some level of return, that capital will go looking in other parts of the market for a similar return. And that could have disastrous effects on the state's long-term need to create housing. So, and again, I want to restate, this is not an appeal to remove all laws related to rent control, or an appeal to say that all supply and demand is the only thing that is necessary to solve all of America's woes or California's woes. Just the opposite. Regulations provide guardrails and provide guidelines for investors to invest their capital. And if the state is really focused on producing, and the people, mind you, because this is a proposition, not something that the state legislators actually wrote, and that should be an indication as to why it could be problematic, is that the state legislators haven't actually passed this bill. But that being said, the voters have got to make a decision about this, and the real question to ask is how is this addressing the key concern? Again, the belief that I think we all have to come to this with this particular proposition is that the goal of Prop 33, according to its proponents, is to provide more affordable housing. And the challenge with that is that while one may create more affordable housing within the existing housing stock, the larger problem is that there is not enough housing stock in the state as it is. If there was more supply than was needed, then the laws of supply and demand would force a more competitive market, and that could have a rent-reducing effect across the board. My opinion on the matter is that we have some pretty good and pretty strict guardrails already in place that prevent landlords from really creating displacement through single year or multi-year rent increases. Most cities have enacted some form of rent control in addition to what the state already has, 1482, which is a statewide rent control ordinance. And we have created protections and ballasts against really, for lack of a better word, smaller landlords that own one, two, or a couple of single-family homes within their family portfolio, and are really not, the large corporations that manage thousands of units. I guess what I'm trying to tell you is that when you're at the voter box and you've got to make a decision as to what to do, my recommendation with any given law, but this one in general, specifically, is understand that the intention is for housing to be more affordable, and that this particular bill is written with a perspective that if we punish the landlords and benefit the tenants, that will help to accomplish the goal. And while it might have a short-lived, it may, in the short run, produce some results. In the long run, it could have a very negative impact on the total number of units that are being sold. When we have policies like this, is that for those of us that do own real estate and are landlords or just even homeowners, that this can have and probably will have an effect on the long-term appreciation rate that we practically depend on, given the high cost of getting into the real estate that we own here in California. My goal for you is to take a look at both sides of the equation. Irrespective of your politics, the rules of supply and demand do not go away. And while some regulation is meaningful, when one is over-regulated, that the investment capital will go to where the profitable returns and meaningful returns are achievable. When it comes to the Justice for Renters Act, Prop 33, I would make the case that you should vote no, irrespective of where you sit on the political spectrum or whether you're a renter, a homeowner, or an investor. And here's essentially why. Is that if you're a renter, the current laws are already protecting your space. Most of you live in a major metropolitan city, and most of you probably have some clear rent control laws. They're already in place. So your rights are already in place and protected. My hope for you is that at some point your world will mature to a level where you're going to be able to buy a piece of real estate yourself. There are programs for 3% down, first-time homebuyer program. My hope for you is that you do that. And when you do that, you will begin to participate in a fantastic vehicle for long-term wealth and stability. If you are a homeowner, this law probably impacts you is very, very, very significantly, because in the event that you need to move, buy another house, and you need to rent out your existing unit, your house, the Justice for Renters Act will all but eliminate your right to vacate that tenant and your right to then relet that unit, let's say long-term, at the market rate several years down the road, if that should ever happen. And that would be, from my perspective, a disastrous outcome for the homeowners that are not necessarily part of the investment class. For the investment class, obviously the reason why we want to vote against Prop 33 is because the law will make it will disincentivize developers from building units given the lack of appetite to purchase the units. And for those of us who already own apartment units, the appetite for anyone to purchase those units, which is the backbone of valuation, is going to be significantly hampered, given the fact that there are other investment opportunities out there and other ways of earning a yield other than owning an apartment unit.